Last week, we witnessed our first Washington State governor's candidate debate, which was conveniently scheduled immediately after last week's lackluster presidential debate. Now, not many people watched it, I know, but I believe that it matters and it's still worth discussing now. This is particularly true because there is another Washington State governor's debate scheduled for Wednesday, September 18th, out in Spokane, and perhaps this video will actually give you just a few more ideas for whatever drinking game you politicos out there might be actually organizing for that debate watch party. And this really isn't how Ferguson wanted you to see him, so here I've actually corrected the image. This is how Ferguson usually portrays himself. However, of course, before you start the debate watch party, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below. And I know many of you complain that YouTube removes your subscription to this channel, but it doesn't take more than just a few seconds to hit that subscribe button down below and then get back to receiving notifications from our videos. I do try to read most of the comments that you leave, and I also respond to many of them, so just tell me what you think down below as well. Now, sure, our tech overlords may be just doing their best to shadow ban us, but you're subscribing and sharing these videos to your friends. It really does improve our visibility. Our videos have been viewed now well over 3 million times so far, so every bit helps. And I know that our videos annoy the corrupt politicians and bureaucrats in office today. So back to Washington State's governor debate and what to watch out for in the next and probably last debate this election cycle. Now, for those completely unaware, Washington State's existing governor here, Governor Jay Inslee, he announced his retirement last year after 12 years occupying the governor's mansion. Inslee decided that he'd done enough damage to the state and he had laid the groundwork for his post-gubernatorial grifting schemes with probably these leftist special interests where he's going to make the big bucks. So he has just been slipping away here to be easily forgotten by the rest of the world while he goes off and enriches himself. Now, Inslee's not going to be missed, but this ended up opening the door for a new governor, and the final two candidates include frontrunner, 12-year incumbent Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who's really best known here for secretly releasing violent sex predators into neighborhoods in our state and looking the other way conveniently while Seattle burned and ignoring government scandals as they have been accidentally exposed over the years. More recently, since 2016, which is now really most of his political career so far, Ferguson has really dedicated most of his time and your tax dollars to litigate against Donald Trump. Not against abusive federal agencies, just against Donald Trump. Now, Ferguson even posts cat photos to get more votes, but even his cat seems to want to escape him. Ferguson is opposed by Republican Dave Reichert, who's the former King County Sheriff, here best known for apprehending Gary Ridgway, who's a Green River murderer back in the day, and also he was the former congressman from the 8th Congressional District. He was the last Republican who has been elected from that congressional district, and he had been retired from politics for a handful of years now. So let's get to the debate itself. First of all, there was no real in-person audience. You had to watch it remotely. And as I mentioned, how it was not uncommon practice for politicos earlier to watch these things, oftentimes creating drinking games in advance, there's one serious danger that I must warn you about right now. If you foolishly said that everyone must take a drink of your favorite alcoholic beverage every time Bob Ferguson said Trump, you would have passed out and ended up in the hospital quickly from acute alcohol poisoning. Ferguson's entire debate prep appeared to be planned around an effort to reference Donald Trump as much as he could possibly repeat that name in a debate environment. Now, I've never seen a politician running for office who has defined their entire political career around another man so clearly as Ferguson has done in this case. It actually is just a bit weird and obsessive and a bit robotic, but I'm sure his legions of lefty pollsters have provided this repetitive talking point for him in this case. So, the public service portion of my video today is to provide a strong warning to those of you who might be crafting these political debate drinking games. I might suggest scaling it back a bit so that you can avoid an emergency room visit by essentially eliminating the consumption to maybe one drink for every dozen times Ferguson says Trump. The life you save could be your own and all your debate watching guests. Now, obviously, there were many official media commentaries about last week's debate. However, this is kind of odd, but my favorite quotes actually came from The Stranger, which is a hard leftist journal from downtown Seattle. And while most of their journalists are hired by the Seattle Times eventually, sometimes their comments are actually pretty funny. And I thought a few quotes from Ashley Nurbovig, I think is how she pronounces her name. She's a staff writer for The Stranger, who apparently was tasked with drafting up their article about the debate. And it was published September 11th. And I'm going to quote here. For his part, Ferguson got nerd mad a couple of times, especially at the beginning of the debate, when he accused the moderators of failing to enforce the rules against Reichert interrupting him. That's the end of the quote. Now, Ferguson does frequently throw fits and tantrums when things don't go his way. His thin skin is legendary among staff and Democrats who despise him and know him best. But there is another quote from the same article, and this one, again, referring to Ferguson. And this was a quote, "In his inability to answer a few questions directly, he still came across as a weaselly Democrat." Now, this is a classic line, and we all know what she means. Now, finally, in my favorite quote from this same article by The Stranger's Ashley, she actually closes with this very accurate and refreshingly candid quote about Ferguson. "But if you see him at a town hall on the campaign trail, then put your hands down and shut your dirty mouths, because this man's not answering any questions directly. He'll tell you what he plans to do as governor once you've earned the right to know." Now, that surprisingly honest quote about Ferguson from the hard left stranger of all places really puts this debate and Bob Ferguson in proper context. And since I've had many friends attend some of Ferguson's presentations lately, it is clear that he will accept no questions from the audience unless they're planted and approved for in advance. So for a governor's race, this is actually how he rolls, which is similar to how Ferguson performed when he ran for the AG's office in the first place. Now, listen, based on Ferguson's canned talking points that were highlighted by last week's debate, and likely to be echoed in the next debate, he has essentially just three objectives. And the highest priority for him is to pretend that despite all evidence to the contrary, he suddenly cares about law and order. Never mind the fact that he looked the other way at every government corruption scandal, every violent riot, a violent secession movement in Seattle, and the direct escalation of crime on his watch, with not a single peep from the AG Ferguson at the time. He knows that he needed the Antifa and the corrupt bureaucrat vote. Now, since he's running against a former law enforcement officer, Ferguson needs to actually pretend that he cares about law and order. He doesn't. He never has. And from his active effort to empty the McNeil Island violent sex predator inmates secretly into neighborhoods near you, to his unwillingness to actually deal with the Department of Corrections scandals, which were releasing violent felons early, to, of course, looking the other way when $600 million or more vanishes from the Department of Employment Services, which is apparently just another day in a bumbling, corrupt government. Who was that insider that turned off the computer controls? Instead, Bob Ferguson's true concerns lie elsewhere. Based on past behavior, he was actually more worried about prosecuting Tim Eyman for running tax-cutting initiatives. How dare he? And, of course, defining the political grift machine of Washington government. Suing Trump, of course, is also a high priority for the press releases, and then preening attention that he's going to get from his lefty friends and donors. And then, of course, hiring more law firms to work for the AG's office in exchange for campaign contributions. His only priority is and remains promoting Bob Ferguson's rapacious political power goals. Now, listen, Ferguson knows that this is a weakness for him. So he's logically expecting the media to cover up his past deficiencies in this area and then pretend that suddenly, inexplicably, and counter to all past behavior, he cares suddenly about public safety only now during an election year. His internal polling clearly shows that he's weak in this area. Now, secondly, Ferguson really knows that he is despised by a majority of voters and residents outside the university campuses like the Evergreen State College and kind of urban cores like downtown Seattle, Olympia, Bellingham, and maybe Spokane. So while he accepts the mathematical fact that he can't win the rural vote, he needs to get a higher percentage, try to find maybe some suckers out there who live rurally to maybe vote for him anyway and then help mitigate his inevitable election losses in these areas. And this is why you saw him suddenly pretend during the debate to care about rural workers, farmers, and maybe farming. And again, this is despite all his behavior over the past 12 years, simply attacking rural living and agriculture. He will pose with just a few dumb farmers or angry workers, maybe, in exchange for some kickback grants to them or their union. And then, once in office, he's going to continue his war on the rural poor and agriculture. Even Ferguson can find a few corrupt peasants to pretend to support him in exchange for kickbacks. And that's just how he rolls, and that's how he thinks about the rural rubes who just don't like him. Now, finally, Ferguson really needs to inspire his base to turn out for him. Since he's just not an inspiring person, he can only do this by basking in the limelight of his obsession with Trump. The Orange Man Bad syndrome is fully entrenched in elitist wealthy enclaves, kind of in and around the Seattle area. And like kind of catnip clickbait, if he just says Trump a bad man enough, he hopes to get voters who are otherwise pretty apathetic about Ferguson's lackluster campaign, and they otherwise may not be that supportive of him. Of course, now, we also have, as an added bonus, Ferguson was able to maneuver Reichert during the debate into kind of a forced and just pointless error by getting Reichert to distance himself from Trump, which, as Ferguson anticipates, might reduce some of Reichert's support around the state, which does require, for Reichert to win, and it requires him to have a very strong turnout of more conservative voters from those rural and suburban areas of the state that have been so hard hit by the abuses of Ferguson and the Inslee administration, particularly over the last 12 years. Now listen, running for office, particularly a statewide office like governor, is not easy. And this is particularly true if you're trying to raise adequate funding to actually run a statewide campaign, and you tend to be surrounded by Republican consultants and political insiders who have just no clue about the real world around them because they live in a bubble. And that's kind of my point here, is right, their advice is almost always bad, and the nuance is the consultants believe that they're imparting to their clients, the candidates running for office. It's actually usually about 20 years out of date. It presumes that the traditional media is more than just a propaganda arm for the state government, and the consultant biases against the real people who actually live here, that's usually palpable with the way they recommend running a political campaign. Now listen, this is actually similar to my critique of the presidential debate last week during the live stream. These politicians are really not professional debaters, and both of them are going to make mistakes. Debates tend to be more about sound bites and not really botching the debate too much. At the governor's level of political campaign, a microscopic fraction of the population is going to ever watch or see this debate. At best, they're only going to see soundbite clips, and they are usually bloopers. If you had watched the Washington State governor's debate with Inslee the last 3 elections, you would have witnessed Inslee getting destroyed by every Republican candidate who ever ran against him, which is why you never really saw the debates. And I'm not sure how many people are really paying attention even this time around. However, I do have a few suggestions for what they're worth to the Republican candidates in particular, including Reichert. When you're in these debate situations, feel free to use these as you see fit or ignore them, but here are my top 3 suggestions. Number 1, your audience is the average voter here. They're not the elite insiders, consultants, or the controlled media. Speak to the voters with clear examples of what you plan to do to help regular people, giving them specific reasons to vote for you over the other guy. In Washington State, if you're the opposition, the Republicans, you need to explain what you would do differently than the corrupt ones who are currently occupying and ossified in those offices today. It would seem logical that this would include policies that would reduce the cost of living, improve public safety, and improve the quality of life for the majority of Washingtonians like these people. Orient your answers around this. If those mythical middle undecided voters are looking for change, you need to demonstrate that you're actually the change they want, not just a slightly less slimy, slightly less corrupt, maybe less weird version of the Democrat politician that you're actually challenging. And don't waste time falling into the Trump trap obsession that everyone in the left currently has. Let them dream, obsess, and kind of foam at the mouth about Trump. It's weird, I admit it, but we've never really seen anything like this before. But the more time that these guys waste kind of dreaming and obsessing about Trump, you can actually spend your time instead discussing your plans for Washington State, whether Trump gets elected president or not. You get no brownie points from any voter in the state if you, as a Republican or outsider, try to match the weird anti-Trumpian rhetoric, and you always run the Rob McKenna risk, which happened in 2012, of dividing your base for just no benefit or return in votes. Sure, you may want to rescue Ferguson's cat here, who wouldn't? But you can feel sorry for it, but you just have to let them have their weird obsession with Trump. Now, number 3, Most Democratic politicians in this state are part of the existing problems that they or their political allies have codified, promoted, or accepted in government. Very few exceptions. People vote for challengers because they want change. Not barely noticed change, not just blue team, red team talk, but a noticeable change in policy direction. Eventually, even in Washington state, the voters get tired of the corruption, the kind of insider grifting class, the escalating costs of living that are caused in no small part by very dumb policy choices made by the governing class that we see today, and the expanding homeless camps, the increasing crime, the collapsing education system, and just the very dumb happy talk of the elites pretending that they've done nothing wrong. The contrast inevitably very much matters, providing it so that people can actually get past the generalities that tend to put them to sleep or maybe cause them to get drunk on the debate drinking word game bingo. I think that's how you win. Now, how much again do these debates matter? Well, it's very hard to tell, but usually not much. However, I am a fan of debates because they at least give you the chance to see a contrast here between the two candidates, even when they're obviously vying for that mythical middle in their positioning statements. Does anyone actually believe Ferguson in these debates? Well, probably not, but you must remember that Democrat incumbents are always given permission to lie about, for example, their refusal to demand more taxes. I mean, seriously, Ferguson actually did this in this recent debate, and not a living soul on this planet, certainly not in our state, can possibly believe that statement. I mean, you really can't. Remember, this was actually Inslee's lie 12 years ago when Inslee knowingly, with malice aforethought, he lied about not seeking more taxes. And then months after taking office, after he was elected, of course, he immediately pushes for more taxes, just like every Democrat in modern times. Every Democrat in Washington state has promoted more taxes, and Ferguson's going to be no different. And this is just another lie that he's simply allowed by the media to tell. So in closing, I will encourage you to watch the next and probably last governor's debate hosted in Spokane. It will probably be a repeat of much that we've already seen. Now be careful about those drinking games for your political insiders out there who want to make the process more interesting and entertaining. Despite the understanding that we all might have with the natural human tendency to drown your sorrows and numb your senses, or perhaps more easily find humor in the dark places of our modern political world, the life you save by avoiding alcoholic overconsumption might just be very well your own. And remember, somebody out there loves you, and it sure isn't the politicians that you're seeing on that screen. But if you want to have an impact on which person you see holding and abusing their public office the next time, that you must engage now and be involved now. You may not be interested in the political process, but those rapacious politicians here, they're certainly interested in you regardless. And eventually, we must try to fix what has been broken by the clowns and crooks in government. It isn't easy, and it isn't as simple as we'd like it to be. And these fixes are just never as fast as we'd want. But we can only fix the problems if we are willing to show up and do the hard work. Now, showing up isn't limited to voting. That is the bare minimum level of civic engagement, of course, but you can actually influence many others in your life. You can adopt a local government entity, maybe a school board or city council or even just a neighborhood group. Start it out there, get your homework done, study the history and the current status, and then find a way to fix what is broken at home. Many of them are. You can only do this if you're willing to show up, and you can only change the future if you're willing to show up and do the work. Because, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.